She is completely delusional. My mother screamed in the silent courtroom, pointing a shaking finger at me. She thinks she is a billionaire and is trying to ruin my son-in-law. Please, Your Honor, she is just a broke accountant. I sat perfectly still, not saying a word. The judge slowly adjusted his glasses, looked at the plaintiff table, and asked a single question, one that made my family lawyer turn completely white. Counselor, do you honestly not know who this woman sitting across from you is? At that point, would you have felt the urge to shout the truth, or would you have stayed quiet and watched the realization hit them? The smell of rot was hidden behind expensive perfume. It was exactly 48 hours before that court session during the centennial celebration of our family's shipyard in Astoria. The Oregon coast was buried under a thick, salt-heavy mist, the kind that masks the sharp edges of the world. My parents, Denise and Timothy, moved through the crowd of local dignitaries like royalty, their laughter ringing out over the sound of the surf. I was the silent observer, standing by the rusted iron cleats of the main pier, clutching a glass of water that no one had offered to refill. Denise had informed me earlier that the itinerary was full, which was her polite way of saying I was no longer a representative of the family business. She looked at me not as a daughter, but as a liability to the image she was trying to project. In her mind, I was just a consultant with a failing practice in Portland, a woman who preferred cargo manifests to country clubs. I didn't correct her. If I'm being honest, I'd been the silent investor in their version of family for years, footing the emotional bills while they overdrew the account. That evening, the spotlight belonged to Garrett, my sister's husband. He stood on the podium, his smile wide and unblinking, announcing his plan for the Blue Coast Resort. He spoke of modern luxury and erasing the eyesore of the old dry docks, the very places where our family had built its name. In hindsight, I see Garrett for who he truly was, a man who believed that if you spoke loud enough, no one would notice the cracks in your foundation. He was selling them an illusion of a billionaire future, while Timothy sat nearby, nodding along with a vacant, wandering gaze. My father was no longer the captain of this ship. Garrett had turned his fading mind into a collateral agreement I had yet to see. That is when I realized a fundamental truth. Some forms of dependence stay invisible until you stop cooperating. I watched Garrett slip away from the crowd to speak with a representative from a waste management firm, a man whose presence had no business at a luxury resort launch. Garrett wasn't planning a hotel. He was planning a liquidation that would turn our Centennial Harbor into a graveyard for industrial waste. I stood in the fog, watching the lights of the party reflect off the oily water. I had the files in my bag, the ones that showed Garrett had been using Timothy's signature to secure high-interest loans for his personal debts. They thought they were celebrating a beginning, but I was the only one who knew the exact depth of the water they were already sinking into. I didn't intervene, because I knew the first rule of asset recovery: you never attempt a rescue until the cargo is officially adrift. Silence is a strategic reserve. Reflecting on those years, I finally understood that loyalty in my family was a subscription where I was the only one footing the bill. At the time, I didn't realize that my willingness to solve their problems in the dark was exactly what allowed them to pretend those problems didn't exist in the light. My role as the family's silent insurer began in 2008. I was 18 years old, and while Denise and Timothy were documenting their summer in Florence, I was sitting in a humid office in Astoria, liquidating my modest inheritance to cover the back wages of 15 shipyard welders. They never asked how the strike was averted or how the lights stayed on. They simply returned, adjusted their silk scarves, and resumed their positions at the head of a table I had rebuilt with my own hands. That was the beginning of my house arrest, a prison without bars where the walls were made of expectation and the locks were forged from guilt. It is a specific type of entrapment. You aren't held by force, but by the belief that if you leave, the entire structure will collapse. For 15 years, I played the part of the boring daughter, the one who stayed in the shadows while Brittany and Garrett danced in the sun. But while they were distracted by the flash of camera bulbs, I was focused on the grit. I carried my grandfather's old brass compass in my pocket, a heavy mechanical weight that reminded me of a time when the shipyard was built on steel, not speculation. It became my North Star as I navigated the world of distressed asset recovery. For the last 5 years, I have been a ghost in the county records office. I didn't want their houses or their cars. I wanted the easements, the specific, often overlooked land use rights that govern access to the deepwater docks. One by one, I purchased the rights to the corridors Garrett needs for his resort. He sees a sprawling map of opportunity. I see a series of gated bottlenecks that I alone control. I waited for the tide to go out, knowing it would eventually reveal the jagged rocks they had built their lives upon. This wasn't a choice made in anger. It was a forensic audit of a relationship that had been insolvent for decades. I was sitting in my car, the fog pressing against the windshield, when my phone vibrated with a message from Hunter, my ex-husband. We hadn't spoken in 6 months, not since I refused to fund his latest business venture. The text was a surgical strike, a legal blackmail attempt targeting my son, Leo. They had manufactured a fraudulent psychological evaluation claiming I was mentally unstable, all to seize control of Leo's educational trust fund. "Your parents have already signed the affidavits, Autumn," Hunter wrote. "I'm filing for an emergency hearing on Monday. Leo is coming to live with me permanently unless you sign over the harbor easements to Garrett's firm today." I stared at the screen until the light faded. They had finally done it. They had moved beyond financial exploitation and entered the territory of human collateral. My parents hadn't just abandoned me. They had sold my son's future to a man they knew was a parasite. The accounting was over. The liquidation was about to begin. Pressure is an atmospheric condition before it's a crisis. Within 12 hours of Hunter's message, the infrastructure of my life began to show signs of structural fatigue. My phone didn't ring. Instead, a formal notification from the State Maritime Board appeared in my inbox. My consulting license was being temporarily suspended following an anonymous report of technical negligence on a cargo survey I had completed 3 weeks ago. This was Garrett's opening move, a deliberate attempt to drain my liquidity and cut off my professional standing. He was using the local regulatory board as a weapon, assuming that a woman in my precarious position would panic at the first sign of lost income. It was a clinical execution of a smear campaign, but I simply printed the notice and added it to the growing file on my desk. I drove down to the shipyard late that evening, the old office at the end of the pier creaking as the tide rolled in. Garrett was already there, leaning against my desk in a suit that cost more than the shipyard's weekly payroll. He looked at the peeling paint and the stacks of manifests with a smirk that was meant to be pity, but was actually fear disguised as arrogance. "You're making this much harder than it needs to be, Autumn," he said, his voice smooth and entirely devoid of empathy. I saw the board's notification. "Without that license, your little firm is insolvent. You can't fight a custody battle from a food bank." I sat in my chair, keeping the desk between us a physical boundary that mirrored the psychological one he couldn't bridge. I watched him, realizing that Denise and Timothy's devotion to this man was a masterpiece of self-deception. If I'm being honest, they didn't love Garrett. They loved the shadow he cast. They were suffering from the illusion of borrowed wealth, a condition where you prioritize the image of success over the reality of your own flesh and blood. To my parents, Garrett wasn't a son-in-law. He was a shield against the realization of their own irrelevance. They didn't see the fraud. They only saw the Ferrari. Garrett leaned forward, his cologne thick enough to choke the salt air. "Hunter is ready to sign. The judge is already inclined to agree with the grandparents. Give me the access easements to the North Harbor, and I'll make sure the Maritime Board's report disappears. I'll even buy Hunter off so he drops the custody case." "You're offering to trade my son's stability for a land use agreement," I said, my voice dropping to a freezing, absolute calm. "I'm offering you a graceful exit." He countered, checking his watch, a gold timepiece that was likely another piece of borrowed collateral. "You have 48 hours. After that, I stop being polite. Or is the shipyard more important to you than Leo?" He walked out, the heavy door slamming behind him and vibrating the glass in the frames. I didn't answer because a response would have been an acknowledgement of his power, and I already knew he had none. The friction he thought he was creating was merely data I was using to map the extent of his desperation. He thought he was closing a trap. I was just confirming the coordinates of his impending bankruptcy. Darkness is a high-resolution lens. I sat in my home office, the blue glow of my encrypted laptop illuminating the stacks of maritime documents I had been dissecting for the last 6 hours. Donovan Cole was already on the secure line, his face a sharp, unyielding presence on the high-definition screen. We weren't just looking at balance sheets anymore. We were conducting a financial autopsy on Garrett's Blue Coast resort. With the clarity of time, I've realized that the loudest voice in the room is usually the one with the empty pockets. True authority doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be undeniable. While Garrett was busy posturing at country clubs, he had been drowning in a $12 million pool of private, high-interest debt. I watched the data streams align, revealing a truth that would have shattered my mother's fragile social world. Garrett wasn't building a hotel. He had already signed a secret contingent sales agreement with a waste management conglomerate to turn our ancestral harbor into an industrial landfill for contaminated sediment. He was planning to bury our family's 100-year legacy under a mountain of toxic sludge just to clear his personal ledgers. My father, Timothy, had been the silent victim in this transaction. Garrett had leveraged Timothy's declining mind to secure the shipyard's master deed as collateral for a predatory loan, a bridge that led nowhere. This was the moment I stopped being an observer. In the world of distressed assets, you don't fight a fire by throwing water on it. You buy the land the fire is burning on. The secondary market is panicked, Autumn, Donovan said, his voice as crisp as a legal summons. The original lenders have flagged the shipyard notes as non-performing. They're looking to dump the risk at any price. Then we become the risk, I replied. I didn't use my personal bank accounts. For 13 years, I had been the silent architect of an investment vehicle specializing in distressed maritime assets. I didn't buy the shipyard from my family. I approached the original lenders who were holding Garrett's defaulted mortgage notes. While they were performing for the cameras, I was quietly purchasing their debt from the banks at a steep discount. By 3:42 a.m., the transaction was finalized. I didn't rescue them. I became their primary creditor. Every signature my father had been coerced into making now belonged to me. Every threat Garrett had issued was now backed by a note that I held. I leaned back in my chair, the salt air from the harbor finally feeling clean again. Execute the acceleration clause. Donovan, I stated, my voice a clinical whisper. We will harvest at 9 a.m. on Monday. The gala was a temple of beautiful lies. Garrett was on stage, his burgundy tuxedo catching the light as he promised $10 million in new funding to investors who didn't know they were buying a waste management graveyard. My mother, Denise, stood near the champagne fountain, looking at the room as if it were her personal kingdom. She believed her son-in-law was a tech visionary, entirely unaware that the chair she was sitting in no longer belonged to her. I walked through the crowd with the clinical detachment of a corporate liquidation team. I didn't look like a consultant from Portland, and I certainly didn't look like the daughter they had spent years dismissing as a secondary character in their story. I approached Denise and handed her a thick manila envelope. Inside wasn't a reconciliatory note or an apology. It was a single $1 bill and a stack of notarized cadastral maps. "What is this, Autumn?" she hissed, her voice vibrating with a mixture of annoyance and social anxiety. "You're embarrassing us. This is Garrett's night." "It's nominal consideration, Denise," I said, my voice dropping to a low, icy whisper that cut through the soft jazz of the ballroom. A legal formality to seal the absolute transfer of the shipyard's master deed to my firm. You and Timothy signed the collateral agreement 3 months ago to fund Garrett's lifestyle. He missed his 90-day grace period, and I just bought your debt for pennies on the dollar. I didn't wait for her to scream. I signaled the technician at the back of the room. The AV tech didn't question me when I handed him the drive. After all, I was still a member of the founding family, and they assumed I was providing the tribute video for my father. The massive cinema screen, the one Garrett was using to display digital renderings of his fake resort, flickered violently. The images of luxury suites and turquoise water vanished into a digital void. In their place appeared the official county zoning maps for the Astoria Harbor. The room went silent, the kind of heavy, pressurized quiet that precedes a catastrophic collapse. These were sophisticated investors from Silicon Valley and New York. They didn't need me to explain the mathematics of the disaster. Every single access road to the Blue Coast Resort was highlighted in sharp, unforgiving red. I owned the easements to every square inch of land surrounding the dry docks. Garrett's project was a landlocked island with no legal entrance. But the final blow was the environmental autopsy I projected on the screen. Decades of heavy industry had left the harbor soil saturated with lead and mercury. The Blue Coast Resort would require a $50 million cleanup before a single guest could ever check in. The industrial landfill project contract, projected 50 feet tall, wasn't just Garrett's secret. It was his only way to monetize a property that was too poisoned to be anything else. The collective gasp of the crowd sounded like the final desperate breath of a dying empire. Garrett stood on the stage, his burgundy jacket suddenly looking 3 sizes too large for his trembling frame. He tried to speak, but his charisma had been liquidated by the truth. I realized then that some forms of power are just masks worn by people who are too afraid to look at their own debts. The gala wasn't a beginning, it was a foreclosure. Justice is less a lightning strike than a slow thaw. We were back in that silent courtroom, the air thick with the smell of floor wax and the low hum of the ventilation system. Hunter sat at the plaintiff's table, his navy suit looking frantic now that his financial backer was a ghost. He tried to lean on the affidavits my parents had signed, the documents that called me a failure and an unfit mother. I sat perfectly still. Years later, I've come to understand that the most dangerous thing you can do to a liar is to give them enough silence to finish their own story. I didn't raise my voice when it was our turn to speak. I simply watched as Donovan presented the audio recordings of the extortion attempt in my kitchen, the sounds of Hunter demanding $42,000 in exchange for my son. I watched the color leave Hunter's face as his own voice filled the room, clinical and cold. It took me years to understand that some people don't actually want to be fathers. They want to be creditors, holding a child over your head as a perpetual debt. Judge Mitchell didn't just dismiss the petition. He formally referred Hunter to the state bar for disbarment and recommended immediate criminal charges for attempted extortion. The fraud charges and the investigation into the industrial waste contract were flagged for the district attorney with extreme priority. As they led Garrett out in handcuffs, he looked at me not with the arrogance of the last few years, but with the hollow eyes of a man who had finally met a ledger he couldn't manipulate. Denise tried to lunge toward the bench, her voice a shrill weapon as she cried about ingratitude, but the bailiff's hand on her shoulder silenced her before she could make a scene. She wasn't a matriarch anymore. She was just a spectator being told to sit down. My parents, Denise and Timothy, sat in the gallery, reduced to the status of observers in a story they no longer controlled. They had spent 3 decades building an empire out of sand and expectations, only to realize that I was the one who owned the tide. I've come to understand that greed is a poor architect. It builds structures with no foundation and expects the world to hold them up. By the time the hearing concluded, they had lost their house, their social standing, and their right to speak for the shipyard. Judge Mitchell looked at Denise and Timothy and informed them that their voting rights in the family trust were suspended pending a full forensic audit. I didn't feel the triumph I expected. I just felt the quiet satisfaction of a completed account. As I walked out of the courtroom, I looked at my mother one last time. She wasn't screaming anymore. She was just a woman realizing that the daughter she had called useless was the only one who could afford to pay for her mistakes. Creation is the only true form of closure. Now, with 3 months of distance between me and that courtroom doors swung shut on my former life, the air in Astoria finally smells of cedar and salt water instead of rot. I am standing on the deck of a restored wooden schooner, the very kind my grandfather used to build before speculatively shifting into steel and debt. Beside me, Leo is no longer the boy who cries into his knees over unlit candles. He is busy learning how to tie a bowline knot, his hands steady and his eyes bright, with the confidence of a child who knows he is the center of his mother's universe. The shipyard has been restructured. It is no longer a liability to be sold or a graveyard for industrial waste. Under the Eleanor Foundation, we have transformed the dry docks into a vocational training center for traditional maritime engineering. We are teaching young people how to build things that last, structures that can withstand the tide, rather than just floating on the surface of an illusion. If I'm being honest, I didn't do this to be a hero. I did it because legacy is the only currency that doesn't lose its value when the market crashes. As for Denise and Timothy, their liquidation is complete. I didn't leave them with nothing, but I ensured they could never again use my son or my shipyard as collateral for their vanity. I purchased a small 2-bedroom cottage for them on the edge of town, far from the social circles that once fueled their narcissism. They receive a monthly stipend, a modest pension that covers their basic needs, and not a penny more. It is a form of conditional grace. I provided the safety net they refused to give me, but the price of that net was their total exclusion from the family business. They are no longer the captains of the manor. They are retired residents in a reality they can no longer manipulate. It took me 3 decades to realize that some people only value you for what you can provide, not for who you are. I spent years trying to earn a seat at a table that was built on my own sacrifices, believing that if I just worked harder, they would eventually see me. But that is the trap of the overlooked daughter. You become the foundation. And because foundations are invisible, everyone forgets you are the only thing keeping the roof from falling in. To anyone listening who currently feels like they are standing at the edge of their own family, watching the party from the shadows, listen to me. You are not a secondary character. You are not a backup plan. You are the only person who holds the ledger of your own worth. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop cooperating with a narrative that requires you to be small. When you stop footing the bill for their illusions, they don't just lose your money, they lose the only thing that made them feel real. Revenge wasn't a lightning strike for me. It was a forensic audit that resulted in a total takeover. I didn't just win a shipyard, I won my time back. I won the right to put my son to sleep without wondering who is plotting to take him away. I won the peace of knowing that my light is no longer being used to cast someone else's shadow. The sun is dipping below the horizon now, painting the Oregon sky in strokes of deep amber and violet. The shipyard lights are flickering on, one by one. They aren't the neon signs of a fake resort. They are the steady, reliable beams of a harbor that finally knows its own value. I am Autumn, I am a mother, and for the first time in my life, I am completely, unapologetically free. If this story resonated with you, I'd really like to hear your perspective. Have you ever had to find the courage to set a boundary that felt like it would tear everything apart, only to find it was the only thing that could save you? What would you have done in my place?